right. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Joan Plank. I'm chair of the Oregon State Capitol Foundation. The Capitol Foundation works to preserve the history and dignity of the building here and connect people with government and get visitors into the building so they know about their Capitol. The foundation is pleased to sponsor the speaker series, which brings engaging conversations like today's discussion to the Capitol. Today we present Jennifer Roberts. She'll be answering the questions: how do recipes work? Why do we collect them? Who do we write them for? And how can recipes help us connect and create communities across time, distance, and culture? Sounds fun. We chose this topic for this presentation today because our popular event, the Oregon's Bounty, a fall festival at the Capitol, is happening this Saturday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. The event celebrates the agricultural harvest, and Ms. Roberts' topic today is an expansion of that theme. It's a very fun event, too, so anybody wants to come, I highly encourage it. Lots of stuff going on. Ms. Roberts is a writer and independent scholar who lives in Josephine County. She received her PhD in English literature from the University of Minnesota, where she discovered her fascination with the history of science and medicine. Studying alchemy and early pharmacology sparked her interest in recipes of all kinds. She's currently working on a novel set in the 17th century that involves alchemy and, of course, recipes. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you so much. And I just want to preface this by saying that this sort of talk that I'll be giving grew out of a conversation with Oregon Humanities. And so it very much involves a lot of interactive components, so asking a lot of questions, getting a lot of response, and so that'll be a component of it. A little bit about myself before we begin. Thanks for the great introduction. As I said, I developed my interest in recipes from studying the history of medicine. I like to cook, but I'm not a big foodie, although I love foodies. I love being around people who love food because they're cool people. But my interest actually came through studying for my dissertation and starting to read some of these early collections of medicine and pharmacology and these early recipe books that were so cool. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a little bit, but I also want to tell a personal story, because what I found about telling people about my interest in recipes is that it always draws out something visceral, something really deep inside us when we talk about recipes and we think about our histories and we think about our personal histories and our family. And I have a story of my own, and that is that my grandma Sherman always used to make the most amazing toffee for Christmas. And she only ever made it for Christmas because she hated making it. But it was so good that my cousin and I once, we were staying at their house for Christmas, and we actually snuck out of the second floor window, opened the window, crawled down the old oak tree onto the back deck, jimmied the lock so that we could get into the kitchen so that we could steal the toffee. That's how good this toffee was. We risked life and limb for this toffee. When my grandmother died, we all wanted to know where this recipe was for this toffee. And so we scoured through her recipe box, and we found it. And it said on the ingredients list, 50 cents worth of Woolworth chocolate. And we were like, thanks, Grandma. Because we don't have Woolworths anymore, and we don't know what 50 cents worth of chocolate is, right? And so ever since then, we've tried to sort of recreate this recipe. And so we, every Christmas, one of us will try, and we've never quite gotten it right. But talking about this recipe really brings up lots of memories of my grandmother, who sort of grew up. She was in her late teens and early 20s in the Depression. And I think about how that recipe reflects her experience of cooking, because it wasn't, right now we might talk about the quality or the brand of the chocolate, and to some extent she did with Woolworths, but for her, she talked about the monetary value. And I thought that sounds like somebody who grew up in the Depression, doesn't it? That 50 cents worth just really stuck with me. And so it conjures all these memories, and then I have all sorts of other stories that I'm sure I'll tell you. So that's sort of my personal experience with recipes. And what I hope for from today, we'll be doing a lot of sort of talking together and talking without me involved. And maybe some of those stories will come up for you and you can share them with each other, because I always love hearing people's stories about recipes. In terms of what'll happen, just to give you a heads up on what today will kind of look like with each other. I'm going to talk a lot because I talk a lot, and I always love sharing cool stuff with people that I've found in my research. So I'll kind of, interject to show you some cool stuff. If you feel like you have questions or want to, pop in with some observations or anything like that, feel free. I'm very casual about that kind of stuff. If you have to get up, stretch, walk out and walk in, please feel free. That's not anything that bothers me. So that's no problem. I want to start out by asking, and I do this in every conversation project that I ever did. I ask people to think for a minute or two about what comes to mind, what words, maybe 2 or 3 words that come to mind when you think of a recipe. And I'll just be quiet and let you think about that for a minute. Does anybody have anything they'd like to pop in with? Maybe we could even go around in a circle. And if you don't feel comfortable, just say, take a pass. Yeah, Stacy.
I was going to say directions.
Stacy said directions, so sort of a guideline, right? And so more the directions than the quantities. Yeah. Is that right?
Directions, and I would say trial and error.
Trial and error, experimentation, even. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah.
Taking advice from somebody who's tried it many different ways, and this is the way that they landed on as being the best way.
Sure, advice from people who've tried it a bunch of different ways and they've settled on this as the best way. And so what thing I think is really interesting about that is that involves that, I talk a lot about recipes forming community. You can't really have a recipe experience without having people come into communion, because it is exactly that transfer of information, right? I mean, any reader experience, I guess, does, right? You have to have a reader and an author. But with recipes, you're bringing in all of these different groups, but it's also just that transference of knowledge from like generation to generation, right? So yeah, really interesting. Like somebody was telling me the other day, I thought this was really like which berry, because, back in the day, you got the wrong berry, you're dead. So you're going to want to write that down, right? Yeah. Yeah. Carla, did you?
I think of flavors, I guess, and profiles. For me, when I read multiple recipes, I start to look at flavor profiles.
Oh.
That's how I know I might like the next one, is that I've read them enough to identify flavor profiles that I like to take from one.
Okay, so Carla was saying sort of flavor profiles from the recipes themselves. If I can follow up on that, you were talking about reading recipe after recipe, and so would those be like in a book or from a family member, or usually how do you do that? All kinds?
Usually, maybe transferring a family recipe to a newer recipe, just to see, if they turn out like my memory of a previous recipe, those kinds of things.
Sure.
So that's how I find comfort and community in recipes.
Sure. And so you're sort of maybe synthesizing different people's approaches to those recipes. And so, hi, how are you? Come on in, make yourself comfortable. Right now we're talking about 2 or 3 words that come to mind when we think of recipes. So we're just kind of going around the room. Something that you said also sort of sparked for me something that Stacy said, which was about experimentation, maybe. So you're sort of making it your own by taking in ingredients, if you will, from the other recipes. Interesting. Okay, cool. Yeah. And Jan.
Oh, I think of recipes, if you follow that recipe, the food's gonna be wonderful.
Yeah.
Recipe is a tried and true thing, instead of just kind of gathering stuff and putting it together, then that's gonna turn out really well.
Sure. Okay. So there's almost an authority. The person who wrote the recipe is an authority, and if you do it this way, it's going to work just fine. Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe later on in our talk, we'll also talk a little bit about what's happening with recipes with new technologies. And, I think of websites now with recipes and long stories before them. And now I realize I don't trust recipes as much after reading a lot of these, because anybody can get on the web and publish a blog, right? But if I read it in a book, then I trust it. Or if my aunt or my grandmother, gave it to me. So it's really interesting that now I wonder if there's a question of who wrote it too, and how much you trust that person. That's really interesting. Something I think we talked about earlier too was that reminded me that somebody else had said.
Oh, well, I just shared that my mother was Norwegian, and we had a lot of Norwegian food as I was growing up, and we didn't use recipes per se. But as time went on, I wrote them down, but they were never quite the same.
Right.
As what she had to do that. So,
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, I think like my grandmother's toffee, there's something that sometimes doesn't always get passed down, or there's a method, or there's just I always think of the book and the movie like Water for Chocolate too. And there's almost something mystical about the person who's doing it too, right? That you just almost feel like you can't capture in a recipe. But you had also mentioned them being sort of all over the place. And I remembered that I did this talk in Eugene, and somebody mentioned clutter. They think of recipes as clutter, which I had never thought of before. But then I thought of my own recipe collection. I was like, oh yeah, sure, because I've got manila folders filled with newspaper clippings of different sizes, and then my computer files of recipes even those are a mess. Like everything's kind of shoved in, and so there is something to that too, which and you had talked about maybe having them and sort of not knowing what to do with them or how to organize them, so that was interesting. I can give you a couple more minutes if you want. Yeah.
Ingredients, does it have garlic in it?
Is that a bad thing or a good thing? That's a good thing. Absolutely. That's got to be the base, right? Yeah, absolutely. Oh, this poor guy that I talked to last night at the hotel, and I was he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm giving this talk. And he said, yeah, I'm allergic to onions. And I thought, oh, honey. That's just sad. Yeah. So does it have garlic? So sort of like flavor profiles, like we were talking about with Carla, like, does it have the favorite thing that you're looking for? And does it, where does it go from there? Kind of, yeah. And you can take a pass if you're not feeling ready.
I was going to say that I think with my grandma having done this, that I've learned that oftentimes you can take an old recipe that you may say you make spaghetti, and then the next day you layer it in a pan and add cottage cheese. So how can you repurpose a recipe or leftovers that you've already made into something else? So make spaghetti lasagna instead of having spaghetti, which is almost the same thing, but a little different.
Yeah.
So if you're not a leftover person, or your family's not leftover people, how do you get them to eat the leftovers?
Sure. There's a pragmatism to it. Absolutely. And a lot of times, and looking, these are the kind of recipes, books, I'll go into it in a minute, that I was looking at when I was researching. They will have multiple recipes for the same thing. Like so this is 17th century England. There are like 6 kajillion recipes for gingerbread, but using whatever ingredients might have been available. And so there's certainly a pragmatism to that too. And a woman in Cave Junction that I talked to about this too was saying that a lot of times her family's recipes relied on not just how many eggs, but what kind of bird laid the egg. Which is kind of interesting in terms of thinking of Oregon's bounty and agriculture and produce that way, because it depended, that made the difference in terms of the measurements, right? So if it's a goose egg, it's going to be a lot more so that you would actually measure the eggs. So it would say 3 cups of eggs, not 3 eggs. And I thought that was really interesting in terms of the way that we've made things so consistent in the grocery store or whatever, and how different that is when you're talking about from the source, something that's from the source. Yeah, Carla?
I think that that's why interpreting historical recipes is interesting, because it's a pinch of this or a handful of that, right?
Yes.
Like, so that's sometimes why I think we could never get it quite right, because I think it was a little different every time, but.
Yeah. There's some really great websites online of people who try to recreate these historical recipes, and they don't mind bringing in modern stuff. I mean, you don't have to do it exactly the way. Yeah, a pinch of that. We'll look at an example of that in this recipe too. And cooking methods are never the same either. And so a woman I know just tried to recreate these lemon wafers that she found in a 17th century cookbook, but it called for using a certain kind of pan over the coals. Well, she has a young daughter. She's not going to actually, cook over coals with her daughter there. And a certain kind of confection paper that you could use to dissolve, and then the wafer. And anyway, so she had to kind of recreate things like that are no longer around. So, but I think in some ways that's sort of what cooking is, right? It's making do with what you've got in some ways. So that, yeah. So one of the things that I've noticed when I'm talking about recipes with people are sort of these 2 strains that go through thinking about it. In one strain, I feel like there's an emotional component. People think of connection. They think of holidays. They think of their family times together, good and bad. But they think of that connection to their history and their culture. And then there's this other strain that's very interesting to me too. And it's about, it was actually exemplified in a talk I did in Corvallis, where a lot of the people in the audience were scientists. And they talked about measurement and exactness and trial and error, experimentation, like you were saying too, Stacy. And the way they talk about it sounds a lot like a scientific experiment. And I thought that was really interesting. I feel like there are these sort of 2 strains. In the recipes that I said, I'm interested in the history of medicine. In the recipe books that I was looking at, those 2 strains absolutely come together physically. In these recipe books, you can have a recipe for fig jam right next to a recipe for acne, or for curing a sty in the eye, next to a recipe for curing breast cancer, cancer of the breast, or perfume, making perfume. And they all get kind of shoved into these recipe books a little bit willy-nilly, because people are writing them down as they find them, as they come across them. And they're personal books. There's a collection that a person might write out for themselves and pass down. So you might have several different hands, because you've got, a daughter or a granddaughter or a grandson. These weren't necessarily gendered either. A lot of physicians had kind of the same thing. And so in some ways, those 2 strains come together in these early recipe books that I'm looking at. And I have an example up here that's been, that's on the board. It's a page from Lady Fanshaw's Book of Receipts from I'd say this is probably from the latter part of the 17th century, so probably 1680 or so, I would guess. That would be a guess. And the recipe, normally I would kind of run over there and point out stuff to you. I don't know how that works with the technology, but I'm just going to do it anyway. I'm going to read off the translation, and then if something needs to be visually pointed out, I'll just kind of point it out. So the recipe is the very last one that's full on that page. And it is, a pointer.
I think it does have a pointer.
See, I'm so low tech, I was like, I'll use my finger. But we can actually have a pointer.
Go back. Okay. Now I messed it up. I had it.
There we go.
Okay.
Yay.
I guess it doesn't have a pointer.
Oh, that's all right. That's okay. With this handwriting, you probably would have a hard time reading it anyway, even if I pointed it out. Sometimes the handwriting can be a little tricksy. But this one is called Against the Biting of a Mad Dog taught by Sir Kenelm Digby. And it reads, crab flowers taken in June or the beginning of July and beat to powder, and thereof as much as will lie upon a shilling, drunk in a pint of warm milk, is a most excellent receipt for anybody that hath been bitten by a mad dog. How do you like that? Now you know when the rabid dog comes around, now you know what to do. You're welcome. Isn't that fascinating? Yeah, so I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Lisa was saying, and hope those flowers are ready in June or July, right? And so there are several things in this recipe that I think are really fascinating. That's one of the main ones, is I think in our recipes today, we've taken out that element of seasons and of harvesting. And I think that goes back to the Oregon's Bounty thing also. When are these ingredients harvested, and does that mean you have to plan ahead, right? So that if you know that you need to have on your shelves a cure for a rabid dog just in case, in June or July, you're gonna go out there and you're gonna harvest those flowers. You might dry them, you might make up the recipe because the milk isn't gonna last very long, right? You might do that. One thing that I thought was interesting was when I was in Corvallis, the scientists in the room were like, oh, I should explain, by crab flowers, it means crab apple flowers, right? The scientists in the room were like, well, those don't bloom in June and July, you know, because they knew, right? And I chuckled at that because they were like, scientific, you know, that's not scientific. But this is England in the 17th century, right? So maybe I'm gonna take their word for it that they did. And that's, I think, an example of the critical import of recipes on health. Because if you get it wrong, as we were saying, if you get it wrong, your cure, whether or not, you know, it works that we know of, your cure is going to be less potent. And so that harvest is really important. And you have to write that down for not just time, but for place. So I think that that's really critically important. Are there any other things about, and I can read it again, things that you notice that might be similar or different to recipes that we have today? Crab flowers taken in June or the beginning of July and beat to powder, and thereof as much as will lie upon a shilling, drunk in a pint of warm milk, is a most excellent receipt for anybody that hath been bitten by a mad dog. And again, the title is Against the Biting of a Mad Dog, taught by Sir Kenelm Digby.
So the measurement on top of a shilling, so the coin size.
Right, the coin size. There's a teaspoon. Right, so there's a form of measurement that's repeatable, right? Yeah, is that what you were going to say as well? Yeah, the shilling size is really interesting. Right, and that's the kind of thing that might have needed to be shown physically, that you couldn't write down. You had to physically do that, as opposed to a pint of milk, where you can measure that and there's no real variance there. Yeah, it's really, so there's a measurement to the ingredient.
And were they must have been dried crab blossoms, what was it, crab blossoms?
Yeah, crab flowers.
Dried
yeah.
First in order to get a powder.
In order to get a powder, exactly. So they would have had to be dried, yeah.
I remember the warm milk.
Warm milk.
Temperature.
Right, exactly. So there's a temperature to it. It's not hot, it's not cold. A lot of times, so one thing that was really important in the history of medicine at this time was the theory of the humors. So that's the medical model that they were working on. And so you were ill. If you were ill, then the physician would figure out which of your humors was out of balance: bile, bile, phlegm, blood. You know, so they would try to balance your humors, and the humors were defined by temperature in addition to moistness. So you had too much of a humor that was hot and cold, hot and wet, or cold and dry. And so you would try to balance those out. And so a really big factor in a lot of these recipes was the temperature. So the fact that it's warm milk is critically important there, I think, yeah. Anything else?
Interesting, it didn't indicate cow or goat or
That's a really good point, yeah.
It's not a matter, probably assumed it's cow.
I would assume it's cow milk, yeah, but that's interesting, yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Anything else?
I think just, as you pointed out, the seasonality
Mm-hmm.
of it, and also just the concept of food as medicine.
Yeah, the concept of food as medicine, which is, of course, having a renaissance, the idea of food as medicine. One of the things about reading through these recipes, too, is that medicine and food, the purposes were clear. If you were cooking something if you were preparing something to cure, that part was made clear. If you were preparing something to eat, that was made clear. The ingredients mingled, but the purpose remained the same. The ingredients mingled, but the purpose was clarified and split out. Whereas I think now there's more of a mingling where we might say if we eat lots of vegetables, it's not just delicious, but healthy. In this case, they would say, I'm cooking this to eat or I'm cooking this to cure something, but it's not mingled. Does that make sense? I'm just sort of pursuing that thought as I talk, which sometimes I do, go off on a little tangent. Yeah.
When it says a cup of milk, if I'm reading a recipe today, I would assume that means 8 ounces, but maybe there it just means the vessel you drank out.
Right, exactly. That could be very variable, absolutely. And so even though I think we have this form of the recipe that looks like, to me, a scientific experiment in some ways, I don't know how many people took chemistry and you had to do the pipette and you had to be just absolutely, it was critical that you get the right number of molecules of X, and much more loosey-goosey in this. And a lot of times, some of the recipes, there's some recipes that to us would seem really, really strange in these. I wrote a whole blog post about a cure for redness of the eye, webs in the eye, that called for dripping pigeon blood into the eye. It didn't specify how large the pigeon was or what kind of pigeon. A lot of times pigeon dung is used and mixed with, white wine or milk or, that kind of, so there are all sorts of ingredients and they don't specify how much dung, and so it's not nearly as specific as you might think. Yeah. I was trying to remember I write occasionally for a blog post called The Recipes Project. If you want to check it out, it's a really cool website. And I wrote one. I kind of gravitate towards the recipes that make you go, even though I think it's problematic for me to do that, but I still do. And one of them was about snail mucus and using snail mucus. And now I'm just going for the grossness factor. Can you tell? And in the blog post, I found out that like in some countries, they now have a spa treatment where you can have the snails. Oh, you've heard of this. The snails actually on your face because it helps your skin. I think it was a skin ailment thing. Yeah, so.
They're harvesting it.
Yeah, and they're fed organic, in a special farm, these snails, and that's one of those examples of recipes where you might kind of go, oh, but then you find out that there actually could be some sort of biological or chemical reason that these recipes were handed down, much like, honey now, honey has antibacterial properties, which explains a lot of recipes. So just to follow up, any other thoughts about?
It's just handwritten.
It's just handwritten. Mm-hmm. The writing is very interesting. Going through these recipe books too, you find yourself very grateful for the people who have clear handwriting because it is very, very hard. There are now transcription projects, which are very, very cool, where citizen volunteer, or not that's citizen science, I'm thinking of, volunteer folks will go in and everybody transcribes a part of a recipe book, and then you can do keyword searches, and if you're interested in that, it's just sort of something that you do to volunteer, but you have to go through line by line and try to help out researchers with this. But that also goes to another thing I was thinking about with this. Does it look like a recipe to you? No. If you just glanced at it, the genre of recipes, it doesn't look like a recipe to you. And every recipe book that I've looked at looks like this, where it's several paragraphs to a page. And it's very consistent. It's a block set of directions. It's one square set of directions. Even if that square goes for the whole page, it's not broken up, but with a title centered in the middle. To me, this is really unusual because there isn't a lot of consistency in this period in anything, right? Like, consistency is not something that the 17th century prided itself in. But in recipes, it is, and I think that that's really interesting. The books themselves sometimes have indices in the beginning so that you can maybe go to a page and try to find the recipe, but that's hit or miss. That's about the only thing that's hit or miss in that. So it doesn't really look like a recipe. If you wanted to find out the ingredients that you needed for a particular recipe, you would have to read the whole thing. We have pulled those ingredients out, right, and put them at the top with the measurements. To me, with the specific measurements that you need, to me that seems so modern. In the sense that we want something that is replicable. We want consistency. We want to make sure that if you go in to make this recipe for Nigella's Guinness cake, it is going to taste exactly like the one you made last St. Patrick's Day, right? And so it's sort of more of a promise. I think you had mentioned too, John, that if you read a recipe, you feel like it's going to taste like it promises it will taste, right? And this seems more like a series of guidelines. But that authority is really interesting. So if you take a recipe from Nigella Lawson, who did the Guinness cake that I was just talking about, she's making a certain promise based on her brand, right? Her promise is she's going to make it taste good no matter how much butter or sugar or alcohol that takes, right? We're not worried about our diets when we read Nigella Lawson. And she's going to be funny and clever while she's doing it. So she has a certain brand, and that's connected to that recipe. I find it really interesting in these early recipes that we have a similar kind of thing happening here with the title of the recipe, that it's not just any cure for the biting of a mad dog, but a cure that was passed down by Sir Kenelm Digby. And he was a famous physician of the time, a very authoritative physician of the time. Did he give this recipe to Lady Fanshawe? Possibly. That might have possibly happened. But what also happened is that recipes would get distributed and changed and all that, but they would still be attributed to that particular person, especially the medical recipes, I think. They didn't necessarily have to be somebody who was a physician or something, but it might be from somebody admired, respected in a social strata that was respected too. So I think that's really interesting. It's kind of like, but we do that now too, right? But without necessarily the same insistence on authority, in that we say it's Aunt Mary's recipe for plum cake or something like that. So we still have that call to authority. And also maybe, now I'm thinking again, guys, sorry. Now I'm going off on one of those little tangent thoughts. Trademark and copyright, right, is one of those things where in recipes, that's sort of like the Wild West, right? You're supposed to give somebody their copyright or their trademark for a recipe, but if you change one little ingredient, you can get away with not giving them the credit. And I'm gonna have to think about that for a little bit because copyright and trademark are also very modern ideas. The fact that you can own an idea or a recipe or a thought. I've done a lot of talking. Did anybody have any follow-up thoughts? Yeah.
The X's in there. Now in my family, we use X's to indicate 1 X means don't ever make it again. 2 X's means I'd eat it again if I had to. 3 X's means, yeah, I'd eat that. And 4 X's is like, please make this often. So I don't, do these X's mean anything there, or just that it's been tried and tested, or?
That is a great question. So the question is, do the X's in the recipe mean anything specific? I would guess that it's probably very personal And hold on, let me go look at the marginal notes, the right in here. So I had two thoughts when you asked that question. The first was I thought it might be a placeholder so that you knew where the recipe begins. But I think the title does that. And so I think you're right that that must mean something like, I tried this one. A lot of times in these recipe books, if you have thoughts about the recipe or its efficacy, you would write it in the margin. In this case, whoever wrote this recipe, maybe Lady Fanshawe, wrote a note that I hadn't noticed before and gave credit to who created it in the marginal notes. So it might be connected to that, but I bet you're right. I bet that's a personal note that means either I tried it and it worked or didn't work. A lot of them do get crossed out. It's a very sort of touching note. I think it was for a recipe for cancer of the breast. No, I'm sorry, it was for a miscarriage. And it said, I tried this and it worked. And it was, but it said it was a very sad way, like it helped me with my symptoms or something like that. So it was a very, and I think not very often do you get that first person, I tried this. It was very touching. So that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know the answer, but I'll have to give that a try. If you want to look at more of these kinds of recipes from, all over the world, from China, India, from all time periods, from, the early Middle Ages to the 1950s, there is a organization called the Wellcome Institute, and they have a library, the Wellcome Library in London. And you can tell I've put the Wellcome images at the bottom to give credit. It's an amazing resource, and it's so cool, and you can lose hours. You can go to this library for free anywhere around the world. I think you have to have an account, but it's just a simple sign-up account, and you can browse these recipe books digitally, hundreds and hundreds of recipe books. You can do keyword searches, so you can try to find it. Like, let's say you want to throw a medieval dinner party. You can do that was another blog post I wrote. It was about how you could cooking a peacock. And what it was that you actually, I don't recommend this, you actually take the peacock skin and wrap it around something that actually tastes good, like a turkey or something like that. And you make it look like a peacock, but it's, I don't recommend that. But there are also all sorts of other recipes, like cooking salmon or cooking fish. No, salmon. I think there are salmon recipes, lots and lots of fish recipes, all sorts of neat baking. There are tons of baking recipes. It's really kind of fun. It's kind of neat. And so you can just lose hours. And there are a lot of websites with videos of people trying these different recipes and the little things that they do to make it change. So that's kind of fun. Sorry, I'm just sort of checking for time over there. So we have this history of recipes, and again, this just happens to be my time period. But we have this history of recipes, and we see that these recipes get handed down through time. And I want to give you guys a couple of minutes to reflect. So we talked about maybe sort of those two strains and how there's this sort of scientific, experiential side. But maybe we can also talk about the side that's a little bit more visceral and a little bit more emotional, and the role sorry, my brain just froze for a minute there. The role that recipes can play emotionally. And to start us off, I want to talk about this word that we haven't talked about yet, the Book of Receipts. Did anybody kind of pick up on that? So receipts was far and away the word that got used the most in this time period to mean recipes. And that continued up until about the early part of the 19th century, late part of the 18th century. Recipes has started to take that over, but it was called receipts. And the root of the word recipe and receipts is recipere, the Latin recipere, which means to give and to receive. So in the word itself is that sense of community, that connection between people. A little bit of etymology about the word receipt too. A lot of times a physician would give a list of ingredients for somebody to make their own cure. I think this is really interesting. If you don't remember anything else, I bet you'll remember this from this talk. And they would take that to their apothecary, and the apothecary would fill it out. And so that was called a receipt, and the abbreviation for that was the RX. Right? I know. It kind of blew my mind a little. I always wondered why the RX for pharmacy or for any of that kind of stuff. So there you go. So because, like I said, medicine and food were so interconnected, the receipt could mean a receipt for gingerbread, or it could mean a receipt for some medical thing. But back to that Latin root, recipere. So you have giving and receiving. And so I'm going to invite you for a minute or two to just sort of think about that community, and maybe think, if you can think of a story to share, that's great. If not, then we'll just kind of talk about some other stuff for a bit. So I'm going to give you a minute or two. Does anybody have a story of a prized recipe or a gift of a recipe that they'd want to share? And if not, that's totally okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll share.
Yeah.
So when my grandmother died a few years back, the one thing that I remember from my childhood is a butterscotch cake that she made.
Yeah.
I absolutely loved that cake. And I did get her recipe when I was back there, but the one thing that I asked my grandfather for was the cake pan that she always used. A lot of times we would be in her motorhome because they traveled a lot, and it was just a very specific cake pan that was silver, and it had the sliding top on it.
Yeah.
So when I asked for that, they lived in Kansas, and my grandpa couldn't do it. He couldn't let go of the cake pan.
Oh.
And it wasn't because he couldn't, he didn't think that he was going to be making the cake pan, but that was also symbolic for him of her. So a couple years after she passed away, I ended up getting a package in the mail, and it was her cake pan. But just that, like, it was okay giving away jewelry, it's okay giving away clothing, but cooking was such a big part of what she did, and dessert specifically, I have to say, because we had dessert after every lunch, we had dessert after every supper, like, dessert was a big thing. So that meant a lot to me. And then this last year, it was the first time I was able to prepare that cake in that pan for my son's 16th birthday.
Oh.
And they, like, love that cake. So it's just one of those things that, yeah, recalls memory, but also makes connection. And it's bigger than just my memory. It's a familial memory.
Absolutely. That's a really special story. That's really neat. And It reminds me a little bit too of another strain that goes through the discussion of recipes, and that's the object itself. In your grandmother's case, it's the specific pan she made. When we talk about recipes, when we do the exercise where we go around the room and we ask people what they think of, sometimes people remember that box, especially if it has a little picture on it, that little tin box where the recipes are kept. Sometimes it's the recipe itself, the card with the smudges and the handwriting. Always the handwriting. It's not just the idea of the recipe or whatever. It's the physical manifestation of that. And so that memory of that object is so powerful. That's a neat story. I like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Both of my kids are living their first year in an apartment, and they've been asking me for some of the recipes, and they're, Mom, just make a Google Doc and they can access. And I did that, but
that's so good.
Handwriting that is lost.
Yes.
So they have the Google Doc, they can see these recipes, but I'm making each of them a recipe book of just their favorites. It's not trying to be every recipe they've ever had or that I've ever cooked, but just some of the favorites in my handwriting.
That's really important.
They can add to it as they like. But I look back at my old recipes, and a lot from my mom, my aunts, my friends. It's in their handwriting, but there's also those that are clipped out of magazines, and I always make some kind of note about what I changed, what I deleted, what I added, and it's seeing those that trigger things as opposed to just a typed document in Google that all that is lost.
I feel like it's a snapshot almost into a time period. It's like a moment in time that there's a little snapshot there. Yeah, it's really,
memories, and I would write in the margin of, like, in the family who liked what.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I like that idea of making the handwriting a component of that gift. Yeah, absolutely. Did somebody say something? Oh, okay, yeah. That's really special. And then, sorry, I had a thought about the handwriting component. I did a talk once where a woman, she said that they actually had a family project where they wanted to bring together their great-grandmother's recipes, but they had been dispersed. So it was like a homecoming of the recipes so that they could copy them, like make a Xerox. You know what I mean? A mimeograph, no, a Xerox of them, and actually distribute them as Christmas presents to the whole family. But it wasn't just like keying them into the computer. It was actually a photocopy of it in there. And so that was really kind of a special thing. That's really cool. Yeah. Yeah, please.
So Lawrence will always forever be tied to frozen cookies, because when my grandma babysat us, they had a freezer in their living room, which they were in a very small apartment, and the bottom half of the freezer was container after container after container, and repurposed, like old mayonnaise jars or whatever, full of different cookies. And so every kind of cookie you've ever heard of imaginable, my grandma loved to bake cookies for us. And I can remember, we're watching the bubbles on Lawrence Welk, and Grandma, we need more coconut washboards, or something like that. So, anyway, frozen cookies.
Yeah. And they were frozen cookies that she had made and frozen.
In her hand. I don't have any in the jars. I wish I had a picture of that. But she, all the jars had the masking tape on the top with written what the cookies were, and she makes a lot of cookies.
Yeah.
A lot.
And that repurposed packaging too. I just saw a meme online. It had, those sweet, like Swedish butter cookie tins, those big ones, right? And the meme said, it's Schrodinger's tin. Inside, it's either cookies or sewing supplies, and you won't know until you open that tin with that repurposed packaging thing. But talking about frozen food too, it's interesting to me that recipes, a lot of times when we think of history and heritage and recipes, we think of like, cooking from scratch and the pioneer women and da-da-da-da-da. A lot of people have these same exact visceral memories from recipes from the 1970s that call for cream of mushroom soup, and you open the tin and you dump it in the thing and da-da-da-da. I love Campbell's bean with bacon soup. I will eat it. It's not necessarily what we value now. Now we value, fresh and organic and healthy and da. It's those memories that matter. And those memories to me are tied with certain places and things. Yeah, exactly. I love that. That's great. Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to share that I grew up on a farm and my mother milked the cow. And we had cows, we had whole milk.
Oh, yeah.
And we separated the cream from the milk and whatever to do that. And then when I was a young person, I had Betty Crocker's cookbook, you see, to do that. And I still, to this day, when I make something that calls for milk, I add cream to it because the old recipes, that milk was more than 3.6 or whatever it is, whole milk was. I'm sure it was much more richer with the butter and the cream of the whole milk.
I want to eat at your house. Yeah.
And regular flour, not, regular flour, real salt.
Yeah.
And those recipes are there. And if you notice the newer cookbooks, even Betty Crocker, they kind of substitute some of the stuff for that. I still go back, and if I want to make the real thing, I go back.
Yeah. That's interesting because I think I do the opposite because
to be altered.
Yeah.
And if you don't know that, it doesn't matter.
Sure.
But
once you've had the real thing.
But if you want remembered the real thing, it might or not be. It's all wrapped up in what you used to see.
I think it's I think it's a really, I think the brain has a way of encoding that particular taste and texture. I think I do the opposite just because I'm lazy and I don't want to buy cream. So I just substitute like 2% milk, which makes like not nearly as good, but I just, but that's really interesting,
And then I have to leave. And I also notice as you grow older, your taste buds change.
Sure.
To do that, and the things that made this. But I always found out if I really want to go and make some really good custard, which I grew up on custard, go and get that really rich milk and make the custard. And
nice.
That's great.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah. And I know you said you have to go do a shift. So thank you for volunteering.
All right.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Oh, good.
With her noting about the wholesome and the healthy ingredients, or the cream, well, I guess cream is maybe not considered healthy, but the richness of that. For me, if I want to get my mom's cookies, I need to use Crisco because that was that period of time when I was a kid. Margarine wasn't a thing, butter was unhealthy, use Crisco. And so those Crisco cookies, even though I'm like, ooh, this shouldn't be good, if you want to taste like mom's cookies,
You got to use Crisco. Isn't that interesting?
Butter, mom's cookies, Crisco.
Oh, funny.
My husband's tacos, Crisco.
Yeah?
Yeah. It does make a difference. It really does. Yeah. Any other stories or?
Just one thing that I would share, because I talked about my grandma, but my great-grandmother back in Kansas too. So she was a working woman, and she also liked the desserts, but she'd be like, what kind of pie do you want? You want apple pie, pumpkin pie, what kind of pie? She opens up her freezer and it's all Mrs. Smith's frozen pie.
Oh.
And it didn't matter that she was like 80 years old. It was like, I don't got time for that.
Yeah.
So, you know what? I guess it doesn't matter what the recipe is. So now every time I see a Mrs. Smith's like frozen pie, I think
you think, exactly. It doesn't have to necessarily be the from scratch thing. Yeah. My daughter's in Thailand right now, and I said to her, are you learning a lot of, cooking stuff? And she said, no, nobody cooks. She said, everybody just goes to the market and buys stuff and brings it home for dinner, the open market. And she said, because the food's so cheap, why would you make it? But that'll still be a part of her taste profile, like you had mentioned before, is that food from the market and stuff. One thing I wanted to point out, we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the amount of crab flowers that would lie on a shilling, or this learning recipes and learning from our grandmothers and grandfathers how to cook. Technology changing how we approach that, and I think it's just so interesting. On Facebook, how many people have seen the video recipes? Those fascinate me because, well, first of all, they usually involve lots of butter, lots of cheese, bacon, and I'm a fan of all those things, but there are certain kinds of things that constantly get there. But to me, they kind of harken back to that idea of standing there with somebody and they're showing you how it's done. And so like we talked, how much powder would lie on a shilling? Well, then you actually are seeing it in the video. And so it's kind of like having your, savvy 30 or something year old teacher, video savvy, showing you how to do something like that. But we don't necessarily have the record, the historical record that recipes provided us, because we can go look up a recipe and assume it's going to be on the cloud. My kids do not keep recipes. Even if they make the same thing over and over again, they go to the computer, they type it in, they might remember where it came from, but they print it out each time. Drives me nuts. But they don't have necessarily that record. And so one of the things that I've learned in talking about this with a lot of people, there's a lot of regret about not keeping those family recipes. And I think it would be, really cool if we valued those more. I think a part of it has to do with gender. I think a lot of times because the cooking was done by the women in our families, we don't value those things the way we might. So I think it's really cool to try to keep that record and hand it down. I want to be respectful of time. I don't know how much time. We turned off, so we're off already.
No, we're not off yet.
Oh, okay. Oh. Because the good stuff happens after it's turned. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But I also have some stories of people who have gathered together their recipes and created community, like was promised across time and space and culture. Oftentimes, I can kind of go through those slides real quickly, or we can just do it after for those people who are interested in staying. But
Let's do that.
so, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. If there's any other follow-up, or anybody want to add anything to what I had to say? I don't have a big conclusion. Like I said, as this is sort of conversationally based, I will just at that point say thank you all for sharing your stories with me.
Thank you. And we'll just end with thank you for coming. It was very interesting. And the bounty is this weekend from 10 to 2 on Saturday. So.
Perfect. All right. Thank you.